Hello. The issue of the stability of power systems, maintaining the balance between electricity production and consumption in the context of the energy transition, is becoming very relevant.
О рисках и угрозах европейской системы.
Our conversation today with Sergey Rozhenko, head of the Power Industry Analytics Group at the consulting company TEK-TOK, is about the risks and threats to the European system, which is a flagship of the energy transition. Hello, Sergey. Hello. Recently, several blackouts have occurred in the European power system. In Portugal, Spain, and France, tens of millions of people were left without electricity. Various reasons for the accidents are being cited. In Spain, the investigation is completely classified. How do you see this situation? Is there a common pattern behind all these local accidents? Undoubtedly, the events of April 28th in Spain, and generally in the Iberian power system, which unites Spain and Portugal, are interesting from many points of view, and I think it's a good entry point to talk about what's happening in the global energy sector. What happened on that day? A large systemic accident occurred in Spain. This is what is beautifully called a blackout in English, but de facto it is a power outage over a very large area. In terms of the size of this accident, it was probably one of the largest, if not the largest, in the entire history of the modern Spanish power system. The entire country was disconnected. Spain and Portugal were cut off, and it took more than 12 hours to restore the power system before electricity was returned to consumers, and the technological consequences were dealt with for several more days, up to a week, with the last introduction of nuclear stations. Why did this happen? There are quite a few versions, but I personally believe that this event has fundamental reasons, and they are of a technical nature. Over the past 10 to 15 years, the Spanish power system has consistently pursued a policy of replacing traditional thermal and nuclear generation with renewable energy sources. The news itself is neutral, but if we delve into the technological essence of the problem or issue, there are peculiarities. They are related to the fact that solar and wind, the main sources of renewable energy, are technologically fundamentally different from traditional generation, as they are based on industrial electronics. In fact, they are like power supplies you might see in your laptop. Traditional generation, on the other hand, involves large rotating machines with something called system inertia. This is essentially the mass of the power system, which allows it to maintain stability and support frequency. In simple terms, the speed of rotation of the electric field. So, when you massively switch to renewable energy sources, this thing, the so-called system inertia, sharply decreases. Therefore, your power system becomes much more vulnerable to any deviations in the power system. And in fact, this is one of the fundamental technical reasons for what happened in Spain. The sequence of the accident is roughly as follows. Before the accident, there was a significant surplus of generation in Spain, export to France. Then, for one reason or another, the electrical connection with France was cut off. A production and consumption imbalance began in Spain, and because the speed of rotation, that is, inertia, was low, the power system began to fail faster, and the system collapsed. Sergey, indeed, in the expert community, the primary cause of the accident is often cited as the imbalance between traditional and renewable generation. At the same time, There are various opinions on the threshold values of this ratio. In some studies, I've seen claims that the system loses stability and balance when renewable sources reach a share of 10%. Somewhere it is said to be 30 or 33 if you look at the Spanish study.
Где-то говорится о 30 и 33, вот если посмотреть испанское исследование.
How do you see this situation? How would you comment as a specialist on these quite widespread assertions?
Утверждение достаточно широко распространенное.
There is a field of science that deals with psychology, particularly the psychology of organizations. And one of the postulates of this theory, one of them, is that the problem of any large organization, energy here as an example, cannot be solved at the level at which it arose. Therefore, in any technical problem concerning large infrastructure systems, and energy here is a large infrastructure system, I always have primary causes that are less related to technology than to organizational, regulatory, and political decisions that are made. In energy, for us, I'll start from afar, but I think you'll understand. We draw a pyramid for ourselves to evaluate the sustainability of decisions in a broad sense, which consists of 3 stages. The meanings of the image of investments. The first thing we consider is meanings. What do we want from energy? What goals should it ensure? These meanings turn into images of what is good and what is bad. And only from there do various management and investment decisions arise. And here, in the Spanish case, the question arises what goals are set for energy companies which they should focus on in their development programs.
На которые они должны ориентироваться в своих программах развития. И парадоксальным оказывается...
And the paradox turns out to be the following, that now, in 2025, energy companies seem to have forgotten how to ensure uninterrupted energy supply, something they were able to do 50 or 60 years ago at a modern level. This is astonishing. And here the reason for the coincidence of synchronous inertia is clear, but it cannot be solved by energy companies because they receive a completely different political narrative. Namely goals for somewhat detached from life tasks for complete decarbonization and solving some abstract problems under very pleasant slogans, which turn into unpleasant consequences.
Очень приятными лозунгами, которые оборачиваются неприятными последствиями.
Speaking of political narratives, continuing your thesis, it is probably worth recalling that the European Union declared the goal of increasing the share of renewable energy sources in energy balances to 50%. There are countries like Spain, by the way, that have surpassed this milestone in an accelerated manner, and so on. In your opinion, can the blackout itself, which shows the vulnerability of this system, somehow adjust these views, which, in general, indeed, to some extent, turned out to be unconfirmed by real practice?
За последние 3 года можно проследить
Over the past 3 years, a trend can be traced towards a decrease in the significance of the climate agenda in the public sphere. If 3 years ago, in 2022, it occupied up to 40 to 45%, then in 2023 and 24. And now there is a trend towards reducing the significance of the climate agenda to a level of 30% and below. And this is a clear trend that can be traced over the years. If before 2022, this agenda was deliberately accelerated by all media, and politicians in the public sphere picked it up as the most, they stood on self-pickup and competed over who would make louder political statements in this area. Then in recent years, it is clear that politicians are gradually moving away from these tasks and replacing them with other slogans. worthy in quotes of occupying the minds of the masses.
И заменять это на другие лозунги,
And unfortunately, at the moment, they are related to issues of confrontation with the Russian Federation.
связаны с вопросами противоборства с Российской Федерацией.
And we see that there is such a replacement in the public sphere, one for the other, smoothly, where under the story of abandoning the so-called dependence on energy from Russia in one form or another, any tasks related to and contradicting some postulates of the green transition, which turned out to be the Bible of the modern world, can now be pushed through.
Библии современного мира.
But the European Commission, nevertheless, does not abandon the goals of the energy transition, including the quantitative designation of the share of renewable energy sources. Sergey, a question in the development of your thesis. Existing power systems, including Spain, constantly face a high degree of variability in the operating modes of renewable energy sources, depending on climatic factors. And smoothing and maintaining balance in this system largely depends on the availability of so-called reserve maneuverable capacities. In connection with the Spanish accident and other situations that arise, it seems to me appropriate to ask whether there are enough reserve capacities in Europe today, and whether this issue is relevant for the European power system at all. Fortunately for industry experts, electricity is one of the most complex technical systems that humanity has built. And when we talk about reserve capacities or balancing sources of different types, we are actually talking about several interconnected but tasks of different nature. If we talk about short-term energy storage systems, such as electrochemical batteries, they do play a significant role in integrating a large volume of renewable energy into the power system, but alongside other technical measures. They play the most significant role in compensating for short-term deviations in renewable energy output from planned levels. Well, when we talk about the order of accumulation, for example, 30 minutes or an hour, in this regard, it is indeed a good story that allows, for example, reserve thermal stations to be started less frequently. That's true. At the same time, two other tasks are not solved by electrochemical storage systems in any way. The first and most global task is the task of long-term energy storage. To make it clear to our listeners what we are arguing about here in power systems, in a broad sense, not in electricity, but in power systems in general, the most significant energy storage is underground gas storage. Gas is pumped there for the winter, and in winter it is actively used. So the capacity of these storages in the form of underground gas storage is about 2 months of consumption of the entire power system. 2 months. And the consumption of all, and the capacity of all electrochemical storage systems that exist in the world today is about 20 minutes of electricity consumption, not even of its consumption, but only of electricity consumption. So, the peculiarity is that there is no physical possibility in the world today to somehow produce enough chemical-based storage systems to cover this task of energy storage for 2 months. It's just physically impossible now. If you remember, a year ago we started with such a constructive thesis that there will be no 100% renewable energy. Today I can fully say the same thing again and develop this thought. Therefore, the task remains unsolved. And another task that is also not solved by electrochemical storage systems in any way. This is the issue of so-called unreliability mode or fast reliability. which just led, presumably, to one of the causes of the accident in the Spanish power system. Because the storage itself has no mass, it doesn't help either. But there are its own technological features, but in fact, the only solution today to have a more or less stable system with a high share of renewable energy is the installation of so-called synchronous compensators. In fact, these are large rotating machines, generators, but without a turbine. This is the way, for example, the Australian power system is going. But in fact, this means the following, that we are abandoning traditional energy and actually building a second traditional energy system to do what it used to do for free. But still, if we talk about storage systems as some kind of compensator that smooths out these fluctuations in demand and consumption, progress in this area has been noticeable recently. After all, supporters of renewable energy focus on the fact that progress, so to speak, technically will make it possible to solve the problem of stability. Is it noticeable here at all? No. No? No. The funniest thing is that for integration in none of the power systems that integrate a lot of renewable energy, energy storage systems play no significant role. Let me give you an example. Today, for example, in the German power system, the installed capacity of renewable energy is, from memory, probably something like 150 gigawatts. The load is about 60. The number of storage systems is negligible in relation to these installed capacities. How does integration occur? There are several factors here.
Несколько факторов. Во-первых, возобновляемые источники энергии, они, в своем роде
Firstly, renewable energy sources, in their own way, parasitize on the reliable power system that was built before. And despite the tripling of the power system's capacity relative to consumption,
значит, потребление в Германии.
In Germany, nevertheless, Germany maintains the full volume of dispatchable capacities, mainly thermal generation, which allows covering this peak if necessary, and integration is ensured by several things. Firstly, it is the geographical distribution of renewable generation sources. What are we talking about? We are actually placing wind farms over a large area, and it turns out that it is unlikely that the wind, for example, will stop blowing everywhere at the same time, or the serious probability that you will make a mistake in the forecast is reduced. After all, predicting the wind at one specific point is very difficult, but predicting the wind over a distributed quantity has been learned quite well. Therefore,
научились довольно качественно.
Therefore, the combination of two factors, the correct placement in the geographical field, and the second, the correct forecasting system, which uses this large distribution over large numbers, allows integrating this system of planning, launching, and stopping dispatchable generation. In addition, all this happens in the huge synchronous power system ENTSO, which covers the entire continental Europe. As you know, recently Germany, which had previously completely abandoned nuclear generation and completely closed its nuclear power units, has actually revised its previous position, without much noise, without any analysis of what was previously done. But such a decision has been made. And now at various levels, the question of what to do with those that were closed, how to restore all this, and so on, is already being discussed. Spain, after this accident, by the way, also announced the refusal to close the remaining nuclear power units and made a negative decision regarding 5, I believe, power units. How do you see this phenomenon? Is it a kind of revision of the view on the power system? Is it a kind of bet on nuclear generation as a more stable source of electricity?
На атомную генерацию как на более устойчивый источник электроэнергии.
Yes, indeed, the attitude towards nuclear energy has fundamentally changed literally over the past 2 years. Moreover, another significant event occurred in the last week. Well, as you know, 2 years ago at one of the COPs, at the Conference of the Parties, a decision was made to triple nuclear capacities. Then it was reaffirmed by the order of the European Union. And just in the last week, such a significant player in the international regulatory field and banking as the World Bank lifted its ban on financing nuclear generation, including in developing countries, which had been in place since 1957. Since 1957, the World Bank has not financed a single project related to nuclear energy. In 2013, after Fukushima, this was institutionally confirmed, and today we are indeed seeing fundamental changes in the attitude towards nuclear energy. And this is the right, good thing that introduces the international discourse on energy supply into a quite pragmatic direction.
Вводит международный дискурс про энергоснабжение в вполне себе прагматическое русло.
It can only be supported here. And here, for example, it is evident that many countries of the Global South, in principle, have been guided by this all their lives and have followed this course in one way or another. For example, China. I would like to ask one more question to conclude our conversation. Today, many experts say that the development of artificial intelligence and data centers will lead to a sharp increase in electricity consumption, and that, in principle, we are heading towards some kind of new energy system that will grow in power and generation volume, and so on. If we accept this assumption as true, as a given, what might the future energy system look like? And what kind of generation will it consist of? That's a good question. I would look at it more broadly. For a very long time, the paradigm of economic development, the modern way of life, was the approach of a total transition to a service economy, where basic industry, engineering, heavy industry, and extractive sectors would play an increasingly smaller role due to a complex of factors, one of which was integration into global supply chains and the transfer of all the dirty or inconvenient parts to developing countries or third world countries. As it turned out, in practice, the world has changed and required a serious revision of these approaches, including a turn towards significant localization of production in all countries that claim sovereignty.
Во всех странах, которые претендуют на суверенитет. И с этой точки зрения,
From this point of view, this is a new input that becomes the basis for energy planning and goal setting in modern energy.
Энергетического планирования и для целеполагания современной энергетики. И с этой точки зрения,
And from this point of view, I think
я
that
думаю, что одним из главных задач
one of the main tasks of developing this industry will be to solve quite pragmatic tasks,
надежное энергоснабжение с запасом,
namely reliable energy supply with a reserve in those geographical points where it is necessary for the development of the country's economy and social sphere. In this regard, Russia has significant tasks that we will have to solve in the next 15 to 20 years, including those related to the construction of a large volume of tens of gigawatts of new, quite traditional thermal nuclear capacities, which will allow us to power new growth points in our country's territory. Thank you.